Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 139 and I am the show's host, Kyle. Foreign Policy Focus is the podcast where I discuss current events related to foreign policy and international news and then give some analysis on those events. If you'd like to take the time to share the show, I would really appreciate it and get this information out there to more people. So foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, the libertarianinstitute.org, or the Facebook page Libertarian Union. The show could be also found on the podcast catchers, iTunes and Stitcher. So as I was reading the news over the weekend, one of the more interesting things I came across was this statement from Mattis. And the article actually really, glorified the statements. It was like, Mattis made his classic 3-word statement on the Afghan policy to make it clear and simple. What Mattis said is, we'll fight them. And while the news story absolutely portrayed this as, this is, a clear direction of what we're now doing in Afghanistan, we're fighting them. And nowhere in the article does anybody ask, Mattis, who is them? What was the point of fighting them? None of this happened. Of course, it's just taken that this is good policy to fight them. But if you look at the theater of Afghanistan at this point, ask who them is, who we should be fighting over there, it's very hard to see a clear enemy, and to say something as vague as we'll fight them is hardly a policy prescription at all for what to do in Afghanistan. Of course, this has been kind of the classic line from the generals coming out of the administration. We'll have, Votel saying we'll fight them more aggressively in Afghanistan, and General Nicholson, who's the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, echoing similar sentiments that we're going to fight them and we'll put U.S. troops closer to the front line. So the policy is just to fight people and fight them more aggressively. But the problem is that they're never looking at who they're actually fighting and what the point of fighting them is. And this is largely the flaw of U.S. foreign policy all over the Middle East and Africa. Since this was brought up in the context of Afghanistan, I would just like to mention, Scott Horton did a Renegade University lecture for, Thaddeus Russell's Renegade University, that's available on that website. I attended it. It was great. Scott gave a lot of great information. I think it ended up being like 6 hours long. One was supposed to be a lot shorter, but it's, well worth your time if you're somebody who really wants to get into what's going on in Afghanistan. I find it an invaluable resource for what I'm trying to do with this podcast. Anyways, getting back to where I was in Mattis's statement of fighting them, there's two real people, I guess, in Taliban, or in Afghanistan right now. You could think of the U.S. fighting. That would be the Taliban and the ISIS-K. Now, neither of these groups were the people who carried out 9/11, which is, the stated reason that the United States remains in Afghanistan. The Al-Qaeda fighters who helped to carry out 9/11, Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, fled from Afghanistan to Pakistan in the immediate months after 9/11. So it's been well over 17 years since anybody who carried out 9/11 was in Afghanistan. But, this is a situation that we have. And so ISIS-K really isn't, necessarily like the kind of terror ISIS group that you have in Syria, that, the caliphate types that you had in Syria and in Iraq. What ISIS-K is it's a faction of the Trinki Taliban who were chased out of Pakistan by Obama's drone war and then joined up in the Nangarhar province of Afghanistan, and likely to receive some help, at least from the Afghani central government that's of course supported by the U.S., but possibly direct help from the United States in getting set up there, thinking that they were going to be a problem for the Taliban, which to some extent they have been, but they've been a much bigger thorn in the side of the American foreign policy in Afghanistan because, of course, Americans demand that the government crush ISIS, and if ISIS is in Afghanistan, this is a problem. Now, like I was saying, that the ISIS-K group is a little bit different from ISIS. I don't think they have goals of a global caliphate. More or less, it's probably branding that they were, becoming a stronger group. At the time, a lot of funds were flowing to ISIS, and so, it looks good to assume the ISIS name. And then the Taliban, which at this point, all the Taliban leadership, all the, original Taliban fighters, I'm sure almost all of them, there's probably relatively few left from the original 2001 Taliban government that governed Afghanistan. So with the Taliban leadership having been killed off, we're a long cry from fighting anybody who was really in Afghanistan in 2001. So if you think of, what Mattis' statement would mean, then we're fighting them in Afghanistan would hopefully mean that we're fighting the bad guys in Afghanistan. At this point, the Taliban have been shifted largely into just what is left of the Pashtun insurgency, basically people of the Pashtun, which is like 40% of the Afghani population, who don't want to live under the control of a Kabul government backed by the United States if that means, they can't have their own laws and customs in their areas. And so every year that America continues to occupy their country, they continue to fight back against the Americans. But, you have to, kind of go a long way to describe them as uniquely bad people in Afghanistan. Remember, the warlords that the United States is backing in Afghanistan, has helped put in power in Afghanistan, are largely the warlords that were chased out of Afghanistan by the Taliban. And they were chased out because, they engaged in rape not only of women, but of children, and really took, young boys as set slaves. And also there were many of them that were drug lords and, cultivated the opium fields, etc. So, these aren't good people on any side of the situation in Afghanistan. So it's not clear by fighting a war against the Pashtuns that you're actually fighting a war against the bad guys or anything, remotely like that. Of course, there are tons of negative parts of the Taliban culture, but in some cases it's actually less repressive than the tribal rule or the rule of the central Afghan government that would be imposed on the people of the Pashtun regions of Afghanistan had the Taliban not been in control. So it's not clear that the Taliban are the bad guys. If you look at this, is also kind of the policy that the United States has in Syria right now. ISIS is gone, and so you kind of shrug your shoulders, which is, why does the United States have 2,000 troops left in Syria? Well, we're fighting them. Well, who's them? I mean, at this point, it's starting to look like them is going to be the Iranians or Hezbollah or Shia militias are directly against the Syrian Arab Army in Syria. Of course, the Syrian Arab Army seems right now much more concerned with all the terrorists the United States armed in the Idlib province and the Kurdish state backed by the United States in the east of that country. But one day, that does seem like it's going to come to a head. And so again, it's not clear that, these Kurds are these Arabs who would otherwise rule the land, if the United States, continues to bat them, would be any better than the Assad government. So again, we're not necessarily on the side of the good guys in any of these places. I just thought it was a really interesting and telling comment how Mattis said it, and then the media just eats it up and they're like, oh, this is such good policy. Yeah, we're gonna go fight them. Want to move on to the Iranian protests. The big news of the Iranian protests is there's not much news to report anymore. It looks like they have fizzled out and have more or less faded. There may still be some minor protests going on. The protesting wasn't even that major in the first place. I had listened to a show done by Marwa Osman, who is Marwa_Osman1, I believe, on Twitter. I highly suggest you check out her work. I think her show may be Syriana Analytics on Twitter. And she does very good work. She covered the protest. She estimated that about a total of 15,000 Iranians would have protested over the several days of protesting. And those aren't major protests in Iran. I think at some points you have like millions of people out protesting, such as in the 2009 Green Revolution, or Green Revolution there that happened in Iran. And so for the US mainstream media to, make them out and label them huge and massive protests as they did over the course of the protest was really misleading. She also points out that, one of the things I point out right away is that, why they started out as peaceful protests. And it seems that what happened is about 10 private banks closed in some more rural area of Iran in a very short amount of time. I guess those banks took with them people's, pensions and other assets and all the money they had in those banks. And so the people were out rioting, protesting, demanding some form of economic justice to be served in this case. Now, I don't know enough about that situation to say, who was in the right and who was in the wrong there, but it does seem the idea that there was some economic protesting, that people in rural Iran have been facing economic hardships. And then, the closure of all these banks in a row was kind of enough of a catalyst to set off some actual protesting. And so I feel like this is pretty close to what I described last Wednesday when I was talking about the show, on the show Iranian protest. And one of the other things to point out was that, after the first day of protesting, it seems like maybe some violent or other groups tried to capitalize on the protesting and turn violent. Now reports are coming out that what they did is they targeted police stations and other maybe military places where they could get guns to go out and try to spark a little bit of a revolution. It seems like this was wholly unsuccessful, and one of the things that actually drove the people who were the actual protesters, for the economic reasons, out of wanting to protest more because they didn't really want to be wrapped up or involved with the protesters that were trying to burn down police stations. One of the things to note here too, and I listened to an interview on the Moderate Rebels podcast, you checked out Matt Blumenthal and Ben Norton's show, and they talked about with guest who I can't remember his name, but basically talking about how there's different kind of factions in Iran, like in the United States. And in the United States, you may have a Tea Party rally at one point in the year and a Black Lives Matter protest at the same time in the year. And that's not to suggest that in any way that these two groups of protesters are, rallying for the same thing or the same policies and are more opposed to each other than they would be the central government. And it seems in Iran that this wasn't one of the groups of protesters that are maybe looking for more liberal civil liberty policies, but we're just looking for some economic relief and we're more rural, conservative types. It looks like maybe Ahmadinejad, the former leader of Iran, will be the one to take the fall for some of this protesting. While there's a lot of reports coming out that the CIA, Mossad, MEK, Iranian Kurds, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the UAE were somehow involved in this protesting. Alls I could say is that I've read the reports and that they're out there and you could read them for yourselves and look into them for yourselves. And I can't draw any conclusion on from what I've seen. But it does look like as far as inside Iran, as maybe a ringleader identified, it may be Ahmadinejad. He has been arrested under charges of creating civil unrest. As I was recording Friday's show, I mentioned that Nikki Haley was at the UN Security Council making a statement looking for a vote on the Iranian protesting going on here. Basically what she said in her statement was she talked about the Iranian protests and how the Iranian government suppresses the people. I guess to that extent, you do have to concede that this is true. It's not like, even though I'm somebody who advocates that the United States shouldn't go to Iran and try to enforce our way of life on the Iranian people, you do have to concede that, the Iranian people live under it with, less liberties and under more oppression than Americans and other people around the world. However, there's several countries that are U.S. allies with similar levels of oppression as Iran. If you look at Saudi Arabia is the prime example. If you're a Palestinian and live in Israel, you have little to no rights. Turkey, that country is oppressed and getting more oppressive. Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, there's always massive protesting going on in Egypt, but Egypt's a U.S. ally, Pakistan, and yet you never see the United States calling for regime change for many of these countries, and, very rarely if you do in any of them, and it's usually just because the United States wants to appoint kind of another sock puppet leader. And so, we could all say that it's bad what happens to the Iranian people, but the fact is that the United States can't make it better by getting involved. I read a New York Times op-ed by Brett Stevens where he suggested that the U.S. launch a massive propaganda campaign against the Iranian regime to create instability and unrest in that country. And, I took to Twitter to say, what do we want? Do we want to destabilize Iran and create another situation like in Iraq or like in Syria where you have civil war? Between those two conflicts, millions of people dead. Do we want to create that in a much larger country with a lot more powerful military in Iraq or in Iran? That would be absolutely devastating. Also, there are some parallels to Syria with Iran that could create some real problem. The MEK and other jihadist factions in Iran are much more repressive groups than the Iranian, even Islamic regime. And so we could be looking at a situation where at least some portion of Iran, the people end up living under Islamic law like that you had in the Islamic Caliphate. And so, it is by no way clear that helping the quote unquote, helping the Iranian people by helping to foment revolution in that country would be a good thing. It also creates a geopolitical nightmare for the United States. We already have these groups blowing up pipelines in Iran. The more pipelines that get destroyed, the more, economic ripple effects that has on a global scale. Even if the United States isn't importing that fuel, if it, goes and hurts the Chinese economy or the Russian economy, that certainly sends ripples as well. Plus, whenever these countries become, destabilized, the borders don't hold and jihadists flow through. In Haley's statement, she also criticizes Iran for being involved in militias in both Syria and Iraq. Of course, they always throw Hezbollah in there, but I've discussed that one before. But this one against Syria and Iraq is really unfair because what Iran did when they supported militias in Syria and Iraq was they were supporting militias that were fighting against jihadists, both ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And so for Nikki Haley to then come out and condemn the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, which the United States also supported, and say that's a problem Iran supports them, is really nonsensical and a double standard. Also, she mentions that the Iranians armed the Houthis. That is absolutely untrue. And, she has absolutely no proof of it. And she stood in front of a bunch of wreckage and, couldn't prove it then. She can't prove it now. So that's kind of where we are in the Iranian protests. I'll continue to update this story as we move along. It looks like for now, kind of stability's occurred, and I'm guessing that if, international actors like Saudi Arabia, Israel, CIA, and United States or something like that are looking to play a role and influence things in Iran, they'll wait until there's some more maybe kind of naturally created instability in Iran and look to capitalize on. One of the big, I guess, geopolitical fallouts here that we could start to see is that Iran is moving closer to Pakistan. We all know, and I've talked about on the show, how the United States has started to move away from Pakistan towards India. And so this could be a really interesting shift in southern Asia and could have new decrees by Mohammed bin Salman. It looks like the decrees were mainly targeting the royals. I guess there's about 1,500 people in Saudi Arabia that are considered princes. With the way that you have the royal family and the polygamy, there's just so many people that I guess are qualifying for the royal benefits that Mohammed bin Salman cut, them paying the water and electric bills for the princes. I'm not sure how much this costs or what this the disruption would be to the lifestyle, but it seems like if you're trying to win popular favor among the Saudi people, this may not be the way to do it. So they were arrested. An interesting thing I found out, and this was also from Marwa Osman on Twitter, is that when you look at the name of the Saudi princes, you all see something like Mohammed bin Salman or Mohammed bin Naif. And what the bin means is son of. So Mohammed bin Salman is Mohammed the son of Solomon, right now is the king of Saudi Arabia. And so if, you're looking at and seeing that, who was arrested and stuff like this might be a good way to help you to track some of the Saudi princes and who they are, who their fathers are. Gained some news out of Zimbabwe that the new regime there is arresting some of the old loyalists to the old regime on corruption charges. Of course, there was a coup there. And it looks like the transition of power from the coup government to the military to whatever new government will form is on track to be peaceful than most scheduled elections in Africa. So whatever's going on there, it doesn't look like it's too horrendous. Even the people charged with corruption right now are being put, released on bail and allowed to get out of jail. So it doesn't look like there's, any real human rights abuses going on. And, things for a power change, things aren't going too bad in Zimbabwe. In Iraq, I think about a month ago on the show, I had mentioned that Sadr, who was one of the leaders of a large portion of the militias in Iraq, had agreed to disband his militia. I read today that the prime minister of Iraq was doing his best to disband the as many of the Shia militias as possible. He's looking to cut the force from 150,000 to 75,000. I guess he plans to do this by asking the militias to bring in their armored vehicles for repair and then just not returning them, and also declaring a bunch of people medically unfit to be in the militias. I guess it's unclear as how well this will work since he's televising it before he does it. The UN is going to send $50 million in aid to Yemen. The people there desperately need it. What's going on there is so brutal. If you look on Twitter, every single day there's more people dying. Saudi Arabia absolutely does not care at this point. It is just blowing up civilian targets daily. As I've said, time and time again, it's an absolute genocide. And the last thing I want to touch on is the United States is going to freeze $125 million in donations to a UN organization that provides aid to Palestinians. Of course, this is just kind of in line with the Trump plan of supporting Israel and not helping the Palestinians. Again, I talked about this on the last show. It's not necessarily that I'm disappointed that the United States is cutting foreign aid. I agree with cutting foreign aid. However, it should come from the Israelis first. As far as it goes with Pakistan, I don't mind the cutting of the aid, which looks like it could be up to $2 billion in security aid. But that doing so is part of a bigger geopolitical move of starting to support India over Pakistan, which has, like I was explaining before, a lot of serious implications for Southern. Alright, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, thelibertarianinstitute.org, or the Facebook page, The Libertarian Union. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE, iTunes and Stitcher. Leave me ratings and reviews there. And my personal website is kylesfilesblog.com, where you can find all my daily news roundups. Thanks, everyone.